be careful, we're writers. Well, don't let us swamp you. We were sending them like stacks and stacks.
And when I was 10, I wrote this essay.
Not even playing. Not even playing.
Sophia says yes, 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 yes. So many. Yes, 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 yes.
So many erasures. That's what Ruth said.
Aquí le traigo un sabor que es maduro y de coco entero, y cantando yo espero que sepan reconocer que esto si viene de dentro y recura de tener. Yo cambio mi...
I am Magogodi. I was born in Soweto, South Africa. I was raised during the end of South Africa's struggle against apartheid. Anybody who is unfamiliar, apartheid is a crime against humanity that was committed, and it was, in a nutshell, Jim Crow plus reservation system here, against Native American people, plus our enslavement of our labor, forced labor, all in one package that was beautifully presented to us by neo-Nazis. I'm being funny while I'm trying to be funny. I don't know how successful I am. But I want to give you a picture of the violence in which I grew up, which was just part of everyday normality, and that sense of white supremacy, which still pervades South African society and culture today. I think that's really important, because when we talk about dismantling white supremacy, I'm not talking about something I have read in a book and came to understand. I'm talking about something that's extremely visceral and that is alive and active for me in just about every moment, unfortunately, of breathing, because it formed the earliest moments of my life and continues to be something I have to contend with, whether I'm ready for it or not. This past spring, or rather beginning of the summer, when George Floyd had a white man press his knee against his neck, it was, I haven't even seen the video because I refused to watch that video, and because it was just such a powerful invocation of this kind of violence that we live with daily, right? And for me personally, I couldn't help but make the connection between George Floyd and my own uncle, George oaMphela, who died alone with a white policeman in South Africa under circumstances we still today do not understand, do not have full information into. But what I know in the marrow of my bone is when news broke about George Floyd, all I could imagine was those last moments being with somebody who does not see your humanity, who refuses to recognize you as fully human, and how alive that pain is in our bodies as Black people, as brown people, and quite frankly, as white people, because the pretense that you can do something like that to another human being, dehumanize them like that, and nothing happens to your own humanity, is so sick, and doubling down on this violence that we keep coming back to in refusing to deal with racism. So this work for me personally is grounded in all the stories that I carry inside of me. It is grounded in my grandmother's you know, Cleyvis and I are both writers, and that's very important to the work that we do, both anti-racist work, but also being in the world kind of work. And I have to say that our qualification for even holding this particular space is not our MFAs or our fancy degrees. We have those. Our qualification is both our lived experience and our deep humanity and humility, and the intersection of this education that has been in ivory towers and the constant work our ancestors have had to do to miseducate us, right? To subvert all that shit that we have been indoctrinated in institutions of learning from preschool all the way through advanced degrees. So when I'm speaking to you today, yes, I'm speaking to you sometimes from a place of scholarship, but please understand, a lot of this knowledge is passed from mother breast to child, and in a way that is like there's no documents for me to, you know, people often at the end of this will ask, hey, could you give us, you know, your sources? Some of those sources, I can't give you my mother's breast milk. And I'm not sure you would necessarily want that specific thing, but I think it's important for us to acknowledge the many different ways of knowing that we come to this work with. Cleyvis, my love.
Thank you. So powerful. You know, my name is Cleyvis Natera, and I am going to be co-facilitating the workshop today, and I am a co-founder, the other co-founder of Love as a Kind of Cure. I'm also an immigrant in the United States. I was born in the Dominican Republic, which is in the Caribbean. You know, in the Dominican Republic, we have a very fraught history with race. And, you know, I think that white supremacy is very much alive in my country. You know, colonization made it so that a lot of us value our worth in its proximity to whiteness. And so that means that in my country, a lot of people actually don't acknowledge themselves as being Black, and they will not call themselves anything close to the word negro. There's like a lot of words we use, trigueño, morenita, you know, these infantilizing words that make it seem like anything but Black. So, you know, the way that I've come to tackle with a lot of the ugliness, you know, in celebration of my history and in celebration of my mixed heritage, you know, we had Tainos in the island that, you know, were wiped out by colonization. We had the enslaved Africans who came from Africa. We had the colonizers that came from Europe. And so, you know, for me, when I think about my own journey through recognizing myself as part of a Black diaspora, it is like fraught with a lot of pain, you know, and it's still a conversation I have with my family. Even though in the Dominican Republic, you know, when you look at data, 80 to 90% of people are descendants of African enslaved people. You know, I would argue that it's like a vast lower number than that would acknowledge themselves as being Black or being part of a Black diaspora. And so for me, like, some of this is really close to home for a lot of reasons. You know, I was raised in Harlem. So again, like, my identity as a human being came from being raised in, like, you know, a community that at the time I was growing up was considered a ghetto in the United States. I went to school with African-American folks, you know, and so my identity is very much aligned with a movement for justice from early on. You know, the personal part of this comes by way of my family, just like Magogodi. You know, my brother was arrested as a teenager for many different circumstances. He ended up in the street, and he was a drug dealer. And even as a teenager, when he got arrested, you know, I remember that, like, when he was in school, my mom was told that he was a gifted student. And I've written quite a bit about this because I think, you know, I come at this work from a place of, I think a lot about how as a society, we're not just robbing people of the potential of their full humanity, but we're robbing ourselves as a society of like the gifts that people can give us for advancement. And so I think about my brother who ended up being deported, and you know, he's fine now. He lives a good life, but there's no doubt in my mind that the life that he is entitled to have was robbed from him because of societal structures that we should tackle. The other part of this for me, it's really personal, is, you know, my children. I'm a mom to two beautiful kids. I have a 5-year-old, Penelope, who's just running this house. She's the boss. And then Julian, who is just a terrific joy. And, you know, my two children, like when I look at the world that I want to leave for them, it is really important to me that I live this world. And I help create a world that deserves their light. And I talk a lot about just we have to do better. And I'm not gonna take the back seat and be like, let the young people in the streets, the protesters, do it. To me, like, each of us have a way to do it. And so just like Magogodi, like, you know, I also have an advanced degree. I have taught extensively both creative writing, English literature, and I have taught I think most people are calling it now like literary activism, which I love, because I'm like, what work isn't? But, you know, I jumped on that bandwagon, and now I call myself a literary activist teacher. So, you know, I'm really a nerd. I love books. I love talking about learning and finding new ways to affect change. I'm really just so excited that all of you are here. Sunday morning, for some of you is evening, for some of you is afternoon. We are just so happy to have all of you here with us and ready to roll up our sleeves and get to the work.
So why you and why now? I mean, we can talk about the historical moment. I think a lot of people who are on this call, I don't think anybody can deny that we're living through something that is momentous and quite different, viscerally different. A lot of you might have seen Oprah and this beautiful town hall she did with a lot of Black leaders, people like Nicole Hannah Jones, and people like, who else was on there?
Ibrahim Kendi was
Ibrahim
there.
Kendi. I mean, if you haven't seen it, highly recommend. Please look it up. But the point that I'm trying to make, and that Oprah articulated really well, is through all of America's particular history, right? Through the civil rights movement, and even after the civil rights movement, all these actions that have been ongoing, all these seeds that people have been planting along the way, we are now reaping the fruit of those seeds. We're living in and what seems and feels sometimes like an explosion of like, oh my goodness, where did all this come from? I think it's really important to recognize that honestly, Black and brown people and some very amazing white people. I mean, I think about Jane Elliott as an example of somebody who's been planting these kinds of seeds all along the way. And now in this moment, because of COVID-19, because of people being really fed up, because of COVID-19 making our inequalities really explicit to us in a way that we can't turn away from, I think that's what has led us to this particular moment of why now? How would you describe it, Cleyvis?
I mean, I think we're primed in a way, because I do think that the pandemic put us all in a really raw and vulnerable place. And we've heard throughout this week, for those of us that have been hanging with us this week in different workshops, I mean, we've heard from some of our incredible speakers talk about this moment and how it's really been a cumulative building of a global movement for justice. And so I think that the fact that we all have been largely isolated has opened up something in us that I think, you know, for many of us, we could no longer look away from like the pain of what it means to live in an unjust world. And so I think the historical aspect of the moment to me speaks to almost an awakening of everybody's humanity. You know, I think whether you're a white person, a Black person, a brown person, however you identify by race or not by race, I think that we all are living through a moment where each of us has to interrogate our own humanity. And yeah, I think that's, you know, the why now. You know, I think to me it's also about this awakening. Largely means that most people are acknowledging that silence is compliance. That in the past, when people said Black Lives Matter, some folks just got to be quiet and be like, let my silence mean whatever, but my intention isn't personal. And I know that I mean well. And I think we're living now in a moment where that's no longer acceptable as a society. And I think that's, to me, that's very, very exciting, because acknowledging that impartiality is what has gotten us to the point where we are today. And that, you know, when people say I am a non-racist in a white supremacist world, it largely translates into upholding the status quo, which is inequality and injustice. And so for me, I absolutely love the possibility that lives inside of this moment that we're all living through together.
Yeah, I would add to this, probe that a little bit deeper, this discussion around being a non-racist and how can you be colorblind or a non-racist in a white supremacist world. There's a really powerful spoken word poem, which we'll share with you afterwards, by a young man his stage name is Juante in Minneapolis. And he speaks about white supremacy as not the shark, but the water. And I find it so powerful and provocative and useful as a metaphor, because we very quickly zero in on the problem person, right? The white policeman who had his knee on George Floyd's neck, and the other, while his glasses, by the way, were just casually hanging out, on his forehead, like he was suntanning, just a very casual. The way in which that was done, the optics are really interesting too. We pretend that he is the problem. We pretend that the woman who's now, I think her name is Amy, correct me if I'm wrong, Cleyvis, but Karen in Central Park, we pretend that Karen in Central Park is the problem, right? So my point here is we love to zero in on the scapegoats, right? So Karen in Central Park is the problem. And as long as we can fire her, cancel her from the face of the earth, hopefully get her a passport and move her to Mars along with the bad cops, then the rest of us are all gonna be fine. But if you understand that white supremacy and racism are not the shark, it's not these individuals that are the problem, it's the water itself. And we've all drunk this water. I mean, to live, you have to drink water. Then I think you're implicated in a very different and important way. To Cleyvis's point, you actually have to show up and pick a side, which takes courage and feels difficult, right? I mean, like, that's not fun work. I don't think anybody wakes up on a Sunday morning and they're like, you know what I'm gonna do right now? I'm gonna confront everybody on like this big stance that I'm taking, and it might cost me something. So I think that's really important and may lead us to your own personal commitment and your own personal why. Why did you log on to this Zoom? Why are you here? Why does this work matter to you? You want to say a little bit more, Cleyvis?
Yeah, I mean, at this point, we would like to invite you just a moment of contemplation, and we're going to give you just 2 minutes. This is not, we have other exciting exercises ahead, but this is just a moment for you to write for yourself, whether it be on your phone, on a piece of paper, say it to yourself in your mind. But, I am committed to anti-racist work because, and then finish the sentence. Like, why are you committing to it? All right, so this is when my nerd soul rejoices. So let's talk about what's gonna happen today. We want to walk you through a framework that Magogodi and I have come together. We've come up with it together to practice anti-racism work. And we're also going to introduce you to 4 branches, which are 4 courses that we're going to be putting together and releasing over the next several months, that will help us tackle what we believe will be seismic shifts in our society. And so we're going to start with our framework. And from a high level, the framework is know better, do better, and create. And what we mean by that is, for know better, we want each of you to consider that the history in the United States has erasures. And I think most of us understand that those erasures have been intentional. And one of the things that Magogodi and I really want to encourage is this idea that in order for us to acknowledge that those erasures exist, we also have to acknowledge that there is a better way to understand history, and that knowing better really largely means understanding the context of what that means today, So we're gonna practice knowing better. Doing better really means that an internal shift in our own behavior and action. And, this is something that when we think about the concept of cumulative action, it really builds on like fact-based understanding of what happened in the past, rooted in the arts, because that's what we do and that's what we believe. Storytellers and different artists are here to help us understand things in a way that might be inaccessible otherwise. Then that will force upon us an interrogation of our own beliefs and our own actions. And through that interrogation, we're going to be able to behave in a way that's different than the way we have behaved historically. And then the last part of the framework is the creation of something new and better. So we're gonna invite the imagination in creating, through our behavior and through our action, creating a very different world for all of us. And so that's kind of the framework that we're gonna bring to the 4 branches of studying anti-racist work. Today's workshop is really going to be a teaser, because we're like, this is exciting. We're gonna give you a taste, and then you're gonna know that we're not messing around. So today we're gonna talk about forced labor and capitalism. And just so you can kind of appreciate like what we're gonna do today is really to walk you through our framework and have you very deeply exercise different activities that are going to help you understand in a deeper way what the framework will do for you personally. And then we will have a conversation that is rooted in academia, and some of it is rooted in understanding history through the lens of artists, so that you guys can also understand what we mean by experiencing knowledge in a different way through our senses, which is largely what artists do. So the first course, the first branch of our learning is going to be forced labor and capitalism, and today you'll get a teaser of that. The second one is demonization, which, so if you think about forced labor and capitalism, largely what we're talking about here is the way in which human beings have exploited each other is not something new. I mean, it's happened for thousands of years. What is different in the manifestation of inequality today is that the struggle for equality and for justice has really transformed. The way in which we continue to practice forced labor has transformed, it has evolved, but it hasn't changed, it persists. And that is completely central to capitalism. So we're gonna talk about that. That also then leads us to the second course, which is really gonna be about, so like how is it possible that like all of us are awake, all of us are walking around the world, yet we have accepted structures that, dehumanize people, that continue to exploit people. And so the reason that has happened is largely because of demonization, right? And so in the second course, we're going to look at the ways in which racism, white supremacy has shown up in a way that for all of us, whether you're a Black person, a brown person, or a white person, all of us are complicit because all of us are upholding this power structure. And largely it's because there's a justification for treating people like they are others, whether it's people who are incarcerated, whether it's people who are migrant workers, migrant human beings. We're going to be talking about what are those structures that help us justify the way that we treat people. The third course is going to be looking at the global framework for both forced labor, white supremacy, and demonization. So we're going to be looking at how this shows up in, like, we're just picking 3 places. And so we're going to look at the Dominican Republic, South Africa, and the United Kingdom. And there is a reason for those choices. And I think those of you that get on this ride with us will understand and appreciate the logic behind it. The fourth course is going to be, I can't even, like, I'm just so excited. I'm like, oh my God, this is so exciting. I need to calm down.
Nerd alert.
The last course is we're gonna explore social movements and why some social movements have been successful, why some social movements have failed. And there's a lot to be unpacked here, because we understand, right, that like we live in a culture, in a system of capitalism that upholds dominant culture. Like the whole point of it is that the way capitalism works is that we have a structure where like very few people hold on to the majority of the wealth, and then the rest of us are like infighting for the crumbs. Like if you listen to Mona El-Tahaway earlier this week in our Fixing Feminism panel, she talked extensively about this concept. So, but there's a lot to be learned. And yesterday in our food panel, we heard Letitia Daring talking about how if we pay attention to the footprints that have been left by our elders, by the others that were trying to fight the good fight, but were not successful. They might have succeeded in some ways, but inequality persists. There's already lessons there that we can learn to then transform the way that we will approach change. And so by the end of the 4 courses, if you bake in know better, do better, create better in each of these courses, we're going to be activating our behavior, activating different actions that will lead us to a really exciting new place.
There's a beautiful quote by Maya Angelou, and we're borrowing some of that language, and she's definitely a woman who we consider our ancestor, and I always say living ancestor, and I think sometimes people get tripped up because they're like, wait a minute, she does know that Maya Angelou is no longer alive, right? But let me tell you something. I come from a culture where my ancestors are alive because I carry them inside of me. There's no disappearance of people, their physical form leaves, but their spirit is very much alive. So when we talk about learning from her and the words that she used to describe when you know better, you do better. And that was a huge teaching that she embodied in her life. And, there's beautiful conversations with her and Oprah digging into that. That's what we're borrowing from. And when I say she's a living ancestor, that's how I mean it. Please don't get creeped out, okay? I don't want people later on, Cleyvis, calling me being like, are you, like this whole mental health thing, how's that going for you?
I think they got you now. All right. So this is what we're going to do. We're going to do the next 3 slides. The next 3 exercises are going to be, they're going to be exercises we're going to ask you to do. So the first one, it begins with you remembering a really great day that you had. And so what we want you to do is to envision the day, and also make sure that there is a photograph that was captured a moment of that day for you. And we don't want you to take the picture out yet. The first part of the exercise is for you to just describe what is in that photograph. And so we're going to ask you to put as much detail as possible. And you're supposed to write pretty furiously, because as you can tell, we don't have a lot of time, even though you thought 90 minutes is so much time. We're already a third of the way through. So we're going to ask you to take 3 minutes. Take 3 minutes right now and think about the day that is in your mind, and then describe a picture that was taken that day. So we're asking you not to look for that photograph. If it's in your phone and easily available, we're gonna ask you to do that part right now. If it's a physical photograph, then we're gonna ask you to do this part as a takeaway. So what we want you to do is to pull up that picture, find that in your phone or find that in your computer. Look at the picture, and what we want you to do is to notice what was different from your description of the photograph, and what was it that your memory erased from that moment. So we want you to take, the first 3 minutes to write about what the differences were, and then the next 4 minutes to talk about how does acknowledging what your brain erased from the original memory make you feel? Like, how does that erasure make you feel? And we're gonna give you 7 minutes because we're baking in also for you finding it. So it's a really cool exercise, and I want to give a little shout out to my friend Heather Bryant, who is also a teacher, and this is it's an exercise that she does a version of this of this exercise, and we've borrowed it from her. Hi friends, is everybody there? Stop writing. I know I can see some of you still writing and not stopping. So Magogodi makes fun of me because I am like, we have to follow the clock. Exactly. So I'm just really curious to hear, for some of you, did some of you find that there was a difference between your memory of the photograph and what you actually wrote down? So write in the chat for us if there was a difference, yes or no. Sophia says yes, 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 yes. So many. Yes, 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 yes.
So many erasures. That's what Ruth said.
Oh, I realized, why was this a favorite day from Sam? Oh, that's so good. I thank all of you that put your reaction to it. We'd read all of it, but now we got to be conscious. We only got 30 minutes to go. So one thing that we want you to think about and know better, what we want you to take from this exercise is the fact that erasures are a normal way that our brains work. So when you think about cognitive and I studied psychology in undergrad, so I actually know what I'm talking about. This is legit. So, in cognitive psychology, we talk about, and it isn't always, I think a lot of us understand that when it comes to trauma, or if you've been impacted in a way where emotionally you face danger, like those erasures tend to be more severe. But in a day-to-day life, we erase things all the time. That's the way our brain works. Our brains don't have room in them, and there's a lot of physiological reasons for that, and emotional reasons for that as well. But the important thing is that the erasures happen, and the erasures are normal. Now, what we want you to consider in the context of racial equity is that when you think about a society that predicates its structure on maintaining a dominant race over another non-dominant race, those erasures have happened very intentionally. And so part of what you'll hear us talk about later is, how erasures have happened both in the construct of how we understand enslavement, in the construct of how we understand capitalism, in the construction of how we think about identity and humanity. And so part of what we need to bring into this work is this acknowledgement of like what you just went through. And I think a lot of people were writing how you feel about this. So let's do this very quickly. For everybody that had a difference, what was your physical reaction to noticing the difference? Not so much what was the difference itself, but what did you feel? Shocked, surprised? Some people gave us the word already, but I want you to just write it for yourself. What was your physical reaction or your emotional reaction in the chat? So we can document it for everybody. Surprised, dismay, lonely, yeah, frustrated that it wasn't more accurate, interesting, yeah, sometimes you're like, what the hell? Annoyed. I kind of felt my stomach drop. Definitely an oh my god moment. overwhelmed, disappointed in myself. So like what we want you to think about, like when you have those physical, like Sophia felt like a pressure. Some people feel like a very physical reaction to like this exercise. I remember when I did it, the difference was huge. Like for some of you, it's like you took your whole physical body out of the picture. For me, it had to do with a landscape, and the landscape in my memory was completely different. And it was really shocking to me. Like I remember being like, oh, what? Am I an unreliable narrator in my own life? So that's a joke for the writers. So part of what we want you to realize though is that that surprise, and we don't have to carry these feelings into the work we're doing, because part of what we want to look at, and I mean feelings that make us feel ashamed or disappointed or sad or lonely, like you don't have to bring that into the work. I think it's like the exercise is just meant to acknowledge that this is the way that our brains work, but that when these erasures happen in an intentional way in our society, it has like really catastrophic impacts on the way we understand and the way that we function. So now we're going to move to the second exercise.
Thanks, everyone. So I want to call your attention, please, to the quote on the screen by Professor Ibram Golani Kendi. He says that being an anti-racist requires persistent self-awareness, constant self-criticism, and regular self-examination. Why is this important? In the context of what we're doing and the way that we've laid out this love as a kind of cure framework. Cleyvis has just walked you through a taste of knowing better. And on this particular slide, we want to focus a little bit on action and behavior and starting to do better. You know, one of the truths about just being a human being, honestly, is we are really good at our busyness, and especially in this society. I mean, we live in a capitalist society, and our productivity is so highly prized. Sometimes we conflate action with busyness, and we also often think that the way that we show up for the causes and the movements we care the most about, like anti-racism, is only when we're really busy showing that we take action and we behave a specific way. So I want to invite you both to recognize and to give credence to the important work of showing up and doing the physicality, the busy stuff, right? That is about dismantling white supremacy and practicing anti-racism. That might look like showing up at a picket and being part of a protest movement physically. But what I want to invite you to right now is to consider the ways in which your quiet moments are just as powerful, maybe even more powerful, because they lead to this insight that is self-awareness, that is self-criticism, creating a bit of white space in your mind and in your being, in your body, to be able to take in what you're doing, to see yourself, and to see yourself as clearly as possible, so that when you do act, when you do change your behavior, there's an alignment between your intention and the impact and the effectiveness of your actions and behavior. So right now I'm going to invite everybody into a moment of reflection. I will lead us through a breathing exercise that is really supposed to focus on reflecting on where you are today as an anti-racist practitioner. I'm not necessarily, you know, there's not necessarily a specific prompt in this breathing exercise, but it's to invite you to become more self-aware so you can become critical in the best and most loving way of yourself as an anti-racist practitioner. So I invite you please to close your eyes You too, Cleyvis. I invite you to please close your eyes. And if it's not noisy around you, sorry, before you close your eyes, if it's not noisy around you, could you please turn just your audio on so we can hear each other? Only if it's not noisy around you, because we're going to need the quiet. Great, thank you. All right, with your audio on, please close your eyes. Now, I would like to invite you to put your feet on the ground and feel the earth. Feel the ground below you. And sit as straight up as you can. Now take one breath, and we're all going to take one breath in. Breathe in. Hold it. Breathe out. Another breath in, please. And an audible ah breath out. Another breath collectively together. Breathe in. And breathe out. Ah. Now, I want you to become aware of yourself. Feel yourself in your body. Notice if you're fidgeting. Notice your breath moving in and out of your body. Notice your mind. Has your mind wandered? Can you look at yourself? Notice how your mind reacts. Oh, this exercise is stupid. Oh, this feels good. Whatever chatter is in your head, just notice it. Notice your breath. Okay, thank you. Open your eyes again now. And please turn off your audio. Please mute. What I'd like you to think about is how your personal self-awareness of you as a person, what the relationship is between that self-awareness and your intention around practicing anti-racism. Can you see yourself in moments that are big and small, not as a self you're attached to, but as a self that you are aware of, with a little bit of remove, so that you can become more critical in a loving way of your actions and your behavior. And I'm going to invite you, even beyond this workshop, to try always to return to your breath in moments of confrontation with somebody calling an idea that you put out in the world as racist, or you reacting to something else that somebody is doing in the world as racist. I invite you to return first to your breath and to yourself, and to have some self-awareness in that moment about how you're behaving, about your action, and whether there's a gap between your intention to practice anti-racism and your action and behavior. Thanks for amusing me with a moment to reflect. Cleyvis?
So the next exercise is a very fun exercise, and we are taking some of that openness. I mean, so the first exercise I know brought up a lot of emotions, and then the second exercise we hope helped to center you a little bit in self-awareness and understanding that, like Magogodi said, sometimes in order for us to affect real change, we have to take a bit of a distance from our attachment to ourselves, you know? And you can do that with a kindness and an empathy for yourself. The next step is really about imagination. So if you have crayons, color pencils, highlighters, I mean, we're all home all the time. So I would be surprised if some of you don't have something you can color with, but it's okay. Even if you don't have a coloring, you can do it with a pencil, with a pen. We want you to imagine that you are your same person, like your descendant. So we're like forwarding 400 years from now, and we're going to ask you to think about yourself as a descendant who is so proud of the work that you did, and so proud of the changes you affected. And we want it to be like a really, like a very quick image of what that grandchild, a 5-year-old grandchild, has drawn for you as a way to say thank you. So we're just gonna do this. We're just gonna use 2 minutes for this. It's supposed to be like a fun, and think about what a 5-year-old child would draw you to say thank you for making a better world for me. All right, let's come back to the room together. So take a picture of it, post it online, tag us. We want to see what you drew for yourself at Love Can Cure. And also, this is a fun exercise if you want to do it later, because I know some of us can't let go. It's like some of you are still thinking about the first exercise, and you're like, I cannot believe I took myself out of that picture. The exercise, you were like, damn it, that eraser. So for those of you who are like me, and have a little hard time loosening up, you can do this exercise later. Now the next part of this, we're gonna do an overview of forced labor and capitalism. This one's mine, right?
Yeah, we're both just, sharing a little bit of what we know. We just want to we want to give you a preface to some beautiful artwork we're going to share in a moment, but we also want to make this relationship between forced labor and capitalism explicit so everybody understands what we're talking about. I'll very quickly give an overview of the beginnings in the United States explicitly of forced labor, and how capitalism plays into that. So we all know, well, a lot of people know from school and history that in 1620, these immigrants came from Europe. They came from the UK, and they were persecuted in Europe, pilgrims, and came here for religious freedoms, right? So that's what you typically have been taught if you went to school at some point in the United States. Actually, even if you went to school outside of the US, like me, this is the received wisdom. Some erasures. The people who came, yes, a lot of the anti-Baptists who came from Europe were persecuted, but they were already people who'd found some religious freedom in countries like Holland. The reason why they actually came to the United States, primarily, the primary reason was pursuit of wealth. And they were pursuing wealth within a capitalist system. As soon as they got here, they understood the need for labor, and they couldn't necessarily turn to Native Americans and enslave them because Native Americans understood their own land better than the people who stole that land. So they turned to Africans, and the introduction of slave labor as we know it in the United States begins around 1619. There's excellent scholarship on this. You can look at Nicole Hannah-Jones, and her project 1619 is a brilliant place to turn. There is Ira Berlin and Many Thousands Lost, his book. It's a scholarly book that looks at the beginnings of America and enslaved people. I mean, there's countless scholars, and we'll share some of them in the aftermath of this workshop, but we really want to bring your attention to the relationship between enslavement and capitalism, and also to point out, I mean, you know, Cleyvis is from the Dominican Republic. There's two things I want to call out. Number one, that the first person who was not native born in New York, the first New Yorker who was a foreign-born New Yorker, is actually an Afro-Dominican man, right? He looked a lot more like Cleyvis than anybody else. And he came from the Dominican Republic. And that's because the Dominican Republic, at least the island of Hispaniola, 100 years before 1619, had already been playing around. The powers, Spain and Portugal, had already been experimenting with this confluence between human bodies being shipped like cattle from Africa, capitalism in the form of sugar plantations, and wealth creation, which we still see the United States and the West, Europe benefiting from. Cleyvis?
One thing that we want to bring to your attention is this idea of the enslavement of people in capitalism. You know, it was for a very long time, there's been this rift between the scholarly work that has been done by economists and other people who like look at the constructs of capitalism and the idea of what role did enslavement play into the creation of capitalism. And we'll share with you guys some books that we think are really critical to this conversation, because for a very long time, one of the erasures that occurred in the concept of capitalism is that enslavement and capitalism were not related, that actually these two constructs happen completely separate from each other. And it just kind of happened to be that they met in the middle, but that, you know, one didn't have anything to do with the other. There were economists that were working in the 30s, in the 40s. In 1974, there was an important book that was written. And again, we'll send you the list. But, you know, this idea that they were separate is a complete lie. And we've heard from economists for over 100 years that enslavement of people wasn't just connected to capitalism, it was central to capitalism. And that when you think about enslavement and capitalism and the fact that the United States became a superpower and one of the globe's wealthiest nations, is absolutely because of the enslavement of African people, the forced labor of Asian communities, the forced labor of Native American communities. So it's really important to understand that as an erasure that has happened. And I would argue that it continues to be perpetrated by the curriculums that we visit when we think about the way that the history of African Americans is taught. You know, when it's February and people are celebrating, you know, writers and scientists and activists, you know, very often we talk about enslavement, but I have yet to see one institution that connects enslavement and capitalism when we talk about what that means. The other thing that we want to say about this, the first branch, is that, well, somebody, I think Susan is talking about poor English folks, and we will in the extended class, teaser, in the extended class, we will talk about forced labor in the form of indentured servitude, because we know that when the Irish, the British brought also people who were incarcerated to the United States as indentured servants, they were forced labor too, but there was a way out of that labor. You know, that it was paid through labor, and then eventually you gain your freedom and you had access to wealth yourself through owning land. But don't get me started, because we'll be here all day. So like the last thing that we want you to think about is the fact that forced labor in this country, in the United States, has not ended. It has, it both persists and it has evolved. So now we're gonna show you, one is a way to look at history through the eyes of an artist, a sculptor, and the other is a way to look at how capitalism has evolved in its use of forced labor in the United States.
That's the Equal Justice Initiative, Brian Stevens' work.
So I spent some time in Alabama as part of a fellowship that I was with PEN America Writing for Justice. And I can tell you guys that seeing the installation, Kwame Akoto Bamfo is a Ghanaian artist. And seeing the movie that we just showed you, this short clip, It's about the installation that lives in the, a lot of people call it the Lynch Museum. And it is one of the most powerful ways that I've experienced history in my life. I remember that day was such a heavy day for those of us that were there. But I remember thinking that day, like this, looking at these statues, at these sculptures, like changed something very dramatically in me as a human being. Because I do think that emotion is divorced from the way that we think about the enslavement of people. And so, you know, one of the things that Magogodi and I are very committed to doing going forward, as we're looking at history and looking at erasures, is to do it through the eyes of these artists, because I think it really does add a different way to experience what it is that, you know, has been erased from our acknowledgement of the humanity of people that were enslaved. Do you want to play the next movie?
Yes.
See if it works.
And what I'd like to say before we watch this next film is the relationship that we think is really important, toggling back between understanding history. A lot of us feel or hear often people saying, wow, slavery was so long ago. Fine, I hear you, enslavement, forced labor, and capitalism. But what does that have to do with me today, right now? And what we know for sure, I mean, I've been an undocumented immigrant in this country. And what I can tell you for a fact is there is such a strong relationship between forced labor and capitalism happening today on these shores, not just in the United States, but since we're focusing in this conversation on that, I want to call that specifically out. And I'm also not pretending that every single immigrant is part of that story. But what we see and what we know and what the scholarship corroborates is that the enslavement of human beings, yes, became illegal after the Civil War, but it has evolved. And incarcerated people today who work on farms like Angola in Louisiana, and people who are forced by economic slavery, honestly, into becoming migrant workers, that is how enslavement has evolved, and forced labor continues to play a role in the economy and capitalism today. This beautiful short that we're going to share with you does such a gorgeous job of illustrating the cost of that forced labor, right? We often, you know, I think it's really interesting if you listen to the news and how people are described who are migrant workers. The emphasis is almost always on what the United States can get out of them, their utility. So we talk about migrant, quote unquote, workers. We talk about dreamers, and we talk about the years of labor ahead of them and skilled labor in the case of dreamers, right? Why are we not talking about those folks in just raw terms of their humanity and understanding the costs that somebody bears when they are part of this system of, you know, not humane labor? And I just want to give a shout out and acknowledgement to Carla Cornejo Villavicencio. Please help me if I'm butchering that pronunciation, Cleyvis. She is a brilliant immigrant woman, Mexicana heritage, and she herself comes from a family with a lot of people who are undocumented, and she does such a beautiful job in her work and her books that is describing the humanity of people and asking us to shift away from this way of looking at people as units. I mean, essentially, that's what we're doing.
¿Cómo estás, buen Frank? ¿Escuchando música? ¿Y el fútbol? ¿Qué onda, amigo? Ya no quieren ni hablar, ya no me ven llegando. A ver, abra, bro. Villani, ¿usted cómo está, amigo? Iba a traer la guitarra para que la viera, pero no, dijo, no, acá voy a andar cargando.
Ah, pero está sola con acordeón. ¿Cómo estás, papá?
¿Bien, Miguel, usted?
Bien.
¿Cómo ha sido de su enfermedad?
Pues hasta los meses que se acabe.
No me acordé, pues, que tenía ganas de un cigarro y no me acordé que...
No, está bien, pero no.
¿Y tú, amigo, cómo te ves? ¿Bien?
¿Cuál es el nombre de la canción?
Aunque digas que me odias, pienso que no es así. Me lo dice tu mirada, que has llorado por mí. Eres joven y experta, que se hace falta vivir. Del amor nada conocer, por eso dudas de mí y me tienes a tu lado. Yo siempre te de cuidar y ya no sentirá. Esta es Susana, cuando estaba chiquilla, Pancho, Susana, y esta es Brenda, y tengo a Mariani. Si estuvieran aquí mis hijos, qué a gusto, estuviéramos aquí contentos, con mis nietos, rodeados de mis nietos, que pues nomás los he visto de lejos ahí en la línea, abrazándonos con los deditos, ¿no? Y es muy difícil, demasiado difícil estar, no compartir las alegrías, las tristezas, los problemas, la comida, el dinero, lo mucho, lo poco que tienen, no compartirlo con sus familias. Eso es lo más triste, estar separados. Aunque digas que me odias, yo pienso que no es así. Me lo dice tu mirada, y hasta has llorado por mí. Eres joven inexperta, pues te hace falta vivir. El amor nada conocer, por eso dudas de mí. Si me tienes a tu lado, yo siempre te he de cuidar, mi chiquilla consentida. Yo siempre te he de adorar, tan chiquilla consentida. No dudes de mi querer y no digas que me odias, ni tú misma te lo querés.
So, one thing that I want to say by way of wrapping up this kind of teaser about the first workshop is that, a lot of the ways in which the enslavement of people and forced labor has transformed through capitalism, right, is this concept that there are these limited resources available to the majority of people in the United States. And so you see people who are poor, working class, really thinking that the danger to their way of being is posed by immigrants and by people who already live in atrocious conditions for the most part. And the concept that like the threat to an American way of life for most day-to-day working class white Americans are an immigrant force, that there's a danger inherent in Black people, that the drug rules, the war on drugs, all of that has really created in a world where like we have these schools to prison pipelines, the neighborhood to prison pipelines. And so what we want to call attention to is a dominant capitalist society where like very few people have most of the wealth in the society. And there's this translation into the fact that like whatever is left for the rest of us, if 90% of the wealth is held by a handful of families, the rest of us are fighting over that 10% of the wealth, right? And so what we want to do is really kind of challenge and interrogate the structures that make people vote and align themselves with political parties that are acting against their best interests, because we have all been taught to demonize and to see the fault, to see resources as scarce, when in fact resources are not scarce. The way that it is being distributed is scarce. So we want to say that by way of finishing this part.
Yeah, and I'll say two things as a wrap up. Number one is I'd like to invite you to think about the very beginning of the workshop, when we asked you about your own personal purpose and what brought you to this work, and invite you to think about your commitment moving forward. A lot of you have been with us from last week Sunday, and you have seen a lot of truly brilliant creatives, artists display different ways in which they're showing up to do anti-racist work, even through something as seemingly unrelated as food, right? It turns out actually the dinner table is exactly the place where you can show up and flex that muscle of anti-racism. So what we invite you to do as well, as we go through a slide that just lets you know succinctly what we'll send to you, is in the comments, please just drop your personal commitment. What is it you're going to do past this movement? Because let's be real, like Freedom Festival is the beginning. Nobody is here pretending that you came, you saw, now suddenly you're fully bona fide anti-racist. Tomorrow, today, the rest of your breath, this is the work. So what are you committing to? And really,
when I want to acknowledge really quickly for those of you that shared with us your reaction to the movies. I saw a lot of heartbreaking, sobering, very sad. This hits close to home. Part of the reason why this afternoon we planned this to be like a self-care brunch at 2:00 is because we know that in order to engage with this work, like Magogodi said before, we have to engage in self-care and really find ways to energize ourselves and commit to ourselves. So right now we're asking you to think about your commitment in the context of like, what is your unique skill? I think a lot of times we think that in order to affect change, we have to do something committed to money or like, and if you have it, yes, you should, but you should really think about what is your unique skill and the gift that you brought into this world, and how can you use that in the service of equality and justice. So we're not going to have time to read any of them, but we'll read them for ourselves.
No, we're not reading them, but I just want to call your attention to some of the things we promised to get to you by mid next week. They will include the 30-day anti-racist challenge and all of the resources and scholars we mentioned on this workshop. As you know, and as Cleyvis spoke about, we're next moving into our anti-racist self-care brunch. We hope you will join us. Voila. Guys, thank you so much for sticking with us. I know we definitely tested that. Appreciate you. I'm going to keep this going and people can sign off, but I'll keep the screen open so if anybody wants to share their commitment, they don't feel rushed.
I'm reading them all. I'm very inspired by these commitments.
Yeah. I'm loving these comments. Thank you so much for coming. Sophia says we're beautiful and brilliant, girl.
Sophia, you're brilliant and you're beautiful.
But we're not disagreeing, are we?
Takes one to know one. Yeah.
That's right. Thank you. Thank you, Deborah. I see your commitment there. To talk to my children. Wow.
Raising anti-racist daughters. I love that.
Love that. Allison says she'd love the links to your writings mentioned on the first slide. Okay, cool. We'll include those too. 100%. You got it. Be careful. We're writers. Well, don't let us swamp you. We were sending them like stacks and stacks.
And when I was 10, I wrote this essay.
Not even playing. Not even playing. By the way, one thing you should know is you can immediately read Cleyvis's beautiful piece about traveling while Black with beautiful, I've seen them, so I can say this, like gorgeous babies, and anti-racism and what that feels like experiencing race and then trying to teach your kids how to be better. Just go to our Instagram page, and if you click link in bio, it's linked in the bio. You might need to scroll down, but it's in there. And it was just published this week at Cupcakes and Cashmere. I love what you're saying here, Richmond. Committing to bring anti-racist work not only to my personal life, but my professional life. Brother, you know we need that. Hopefully to help facilitate change within the fashion industry. All day, please. All day. All day. Because this is the thing. No, I mean, this is the thing. This is what I've seen consistently. I think people sometimes think that, you know, what we do at work has to be our work selves, and then what we do privately and what we believe privately need to be separate things. But part of your magic, part of what is amazing about you at work is all these other things about you, you know, and bringing that into work, using it to challenge and to encourage and to love people up. That's how you're going to get them to do, you know, best, to do better, to be better, right?
Yeah, I love that, Richmond. I also want to acknowledge Elizabeth Garcia. She's saying that, you know, she's committed to having anti-racist conversations with those closest to her in her family. And because what the work requires is for all of us to become ambassadors of change. And I think once we all embody that and all of us acknowledge that, I mean, I had a conversation with like a very close person to me in my family very recently. She was making incredibly racist remarks. And it was couched as like not being racist because the intention wasn't racist. And it's just, you know, having to do that, having to say, call people on it. We're going to do it, Elizabeth. We're in this fight together. So.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, everyone. I see the shares have stopped, so I think it's safe to stop recording and end the call. Thank you for sticking around. You guys are all the way hearts. And man, talk about like some anti-racist warriors up in here, Cleyvis.
I'm pumped. I'm like, let's go. Let's go.
These are the true believers. We love you, and we can't wait to be with you at 2 p.m. Let's go get freshened up.
Yeah, let's do it. We love you guys. Bye. Thank you for coming.